Hi everyone, and welcome back to another edition of BCC's Tarot Tips. And today I'm going to ask you to take a magnifying glass to your cards. Oh, you've got something in your teeth. Did you know? So obviously what this is about is asking you to look more closely at your tarot cards. You can do this with any deck that you own. I'm going to use my trusty giant-sized Rider-Waite Smith deck to demonstrate. And I do have my magnifying glass at hand, but I think I'll be able to show you just on the camera. So where the idea for this tip came from is really just over the years I have noticed things in various tarot decks that I hadn't spotted when I first looked at them. And of course some of these things that I'm about to describe to you from the Rider-Waite Smith deck, many of you will already be aware of because it's not as though others haven't discovered them. But I still find regularly that I'll mention something in the Rider-Waite Smith deck that I've known about for a while but didn't know about originally, and somebody will say, you know, I'd never ever noticed that. So it made it very clear to me that we might be familiar with our decks and we might know what our cards mean in particular contexts, but we always can find additional meaning, different layers of meaning if we look a little bit more closely. And I'll talk a bit more about how we can apply that in a tarot reading in a second. But let's just start by having a look at some of the symbols on the cards themselves. Now, this is a card that I showed in an earlier video in the Tarot Tips series, and one of the things I mentioned, or it might have been in my, I can't remember, it might have been my astrology series, who knows, I do so many videos, who knows when I mentioned it, but at some point I mentioned it, and a few people said, oh, I hadn't noticed that before. And what I was talking about was on the bedspread of this person in the Nine of Swords, obviously we've got pictures of roses and so on, but if you look at the little blue squares, these are actually astrological symbols. There's a symbol for Gemini, there's a symbol for the moon, there's a symbol for Aries. I think that's, maybe, never mind magnifying glass, I probably need my glasses. Well, there's Mercury down at the bottom. Am I pointing at the right one? Yeah, Mercury. So there are astrological symbols there. So one of the things we might ask ourselves is, what does this mean if you have somebody who is mentally tormented in some way, tormented by their thoughts or having difficulty with their thoughts, looking at or not looking at, covering their face as they're oriented towards this patchwork that's spread out in front of them of all the astrological symbols. What does that mean in a reading? What does that tell us about this person's position, about their potential, about what they might be missing, about what they could potentially see if they weren't in a position where they were struggling with their the challenge that the card represents. So there's a lot in this card already, and knowing that the astrological symbols are there, especially if you're into astrology, opened up a new dimension of meaning. So I mentioned that one. Here is another one with another astrological symbol. Some of you will be aware of this. It's the good old devil. But the key thing here, particularly in this version of the Rider-Waite Smith deck, it doesn't appear in all of them because of the way that the cards, particularly newer versions, have been coloured. But in the original and in the versions that are more traditional, if you like, and stick to the original artwork and colouring, you'll see on the devil's hand, his outstretched, opened up hand, is actually, it's not very clear, but it is at the same time relatively distinct. It looks as though they are just lines on his hands, but they are broadly the astrological symbol for Saturn. Why is that important? Well, Saturn is the planet that the Devil card represents, if you want to link astrology to tarot in the Golden Dawn system. But the Saturn symbol also opens up new layers of meaning to the devil, because the devil quite often in tarot has a negative reputation. Obviously the card can represent attachment, it can represent temptation, it can represent some of the more negative sides of human frailty, if you like. But what Saturn does, what the symbol for Saturn does, is, I think, open up the meaning, because Saturn in astrology, in astrological thought, isn't just a negative card. It's sometimes called a negative planet. It's sometimes called a malefic because it is, in traditional astrology, considered to have quite restrictive, quite difficult influences. But increasingly in astrology, astrologers are looking at how that can also represent necessary structures, necessary time-bound structures. So Liz Green wrote the book Saturn, and you look at an old devil back in the 80s, I think, and that was about looking at Saturn from a different point of view. And having the Saturn symbol on the devil card reminds me to look at the devil from a different point of view. So when the devil turns up in a reading for me, it doesn't automatically mean that something negative is happening, or even that my perception of the situation is negative. What it might say to me is either you are dealing with some restriction here, or it might be saying to me in certain circumstances, depending on the context of the reading of course, that you need to apply some restrictions and parameters around what you're trying to achieve. So that's another useful little tip from the devil. Now let's have a look at a couple of cards. Death and the moon. Why am I showing these together? Well, let's have a look at the moon first. We have the two towers with the moon looking down, and there's the dog and the wolf howling at the moon, etc., etc. And those towers appear, guess what, at the back of the death card. And this time they are there with the sun rising above them, or setting, depending on how you want to interpret this, in terms of, is it the sun setting or is it the sun rising? But there's something there about seeing things from a different perspective. So there's a link between these cards, and really it's for you to determine for yourself what you think that link is, whether you think that the death card is representing something that the moon offers, or vice versa. Also, why are the towers of the moon in the background of the death card? We'll come to a bit about foregrounding and backgrounding in symbols in a second, but it's interesting to notice a link between those cards. Obviously the moon follows death in the chronological sequence of the major arcana, so there might be something there about in the setting of the sun, if that's how you see this, which would make sense in relation to death, the ending of things. What does that mean in terms of the moon coming later? And what about this creature emerging from the water? It could be a representative of new life emerging from the waters. So after death, there is rebirth. That's another little interesting pair. Another pair to look at is the High Priestess and the Empress, and just a very simple thing to show you here, apart from the fact that we are dealing with two of the early majors. You might also notice that the robes of the High Priestess turn into water towards the bottom of the card, if you look really closely, and the water trickles off to this side of the card, and you could argue flows down behind the Empress and into this waterfall. So there's something there about the wonderful continuity of the major arcana in the tarot, if you look at that. Another thing to look at is whether symbols recur, and one of the things that I noticed in this card fairly early on in my exploration of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is, look, the lilies and the roses. Now, where have I seen those before, I thought? I have seen them in The Magician. The lilies and the roses. Now there's something about the magician representing manifestation and bringing thought into reality, and of course here you have a card that is very much representative, I think, of somebody who has reached some kind of material comfort and status, has got the world in the palm of his hand, has got structure and balance around him. We can also speculate whether there's something missing here, but certainly there's an echo of the magician, the idea of as above, so below, and the magician, who of course holds a wand in his hand as a way of directing power. Now here we have him holding a wand, or a man holding a wand, earthed to the ground. So that potential has been realised. That's another little thing. Now this is an interesting one that I only noticed very recently, and I might need my magnifying glass to show you this, but here's our good old friend from the Seven of Swords. Now normally I see that card, and many of us see that card and go, oh yes, that's about kind of, you know, doing something a bit underhand, maybe taking something that isn't yours. All very interesting, and sometimes we notice that he seems to be running away from these tents, etc. But did you notice that in the background of the card there seems to be a group of people? That's how I see it anyway. There seems to be a group of people there, and it seems to me that there's somebody with a long pole climbing up onto something and other people down below. Now, what does that remind you of? It reminds me of this card. Somebody who has got a long pole and other people below with their pole. So here's the 7 of rods in the background of the 7 of swords. Now, how interesting. They're both 7s, so there's a connection there already. What might it say to us? It might say, I think it might say that while you're busy defending and conflicting and being kind of aware of all the things that could be going wrong, things that you're not paying attention to could also be slipping away from you. So sometimes it's about making sure you've got your eye on the ball and looking all around and not just in front. Again, why would that be in the background of this card? It's important not to, for example, assume that this card means the same as this one. This symbol, if you accept that this is the symbol that's hidden in the back of this card, is in the back of this card. So obviously it's not the key symbol. The key symbol is this guy in the front, but nonetheless it adds added texture. Okay, we're nearly there with my example. 2 more. Oh no, 3 more. So here's another one. The card of choice. My goodness, which one will you choose? Well, that golden wreath looks rather interesting. Well, let's have that. That would look really great on my head, but oh my goodness, there is a skull on that card, so I'm not sure. Maybe that one's a poison chalice? Who knows? Now that symbol, incidentally, I believe, has something to do with Masonic initiations, etc., and would have been put there by Arthur Edward Waite to represent that side of things. So you can look into that if you wanted to for a bit more information. Here's another one. This is a favourite of mine. I call him Brian the Snail. Now, I know that a lot of people know that this is a snail at the bottom of this card, but many people are so focused on the falcon and the woman, and they just think this is a little bit of pebble or something. It's not. It's an actual snail. Now, I don't think that Arthur Edward Waite or Pamela Coleman Smith put anything into these cards that was accidental. So, what might the snail mean? Well, the snail has representations in Egyptian mythology and in various other mythologies, very much about, of course, carrying your home on your back, being self-reliant, also about the spiral of life, the idea that you know, life is a spiral, that you go through the same cycles again and again and again, but at different levels. And also about the fact that snail shells also make me think of fossils, that kind of fossilized kind of circular spiral ammonites, I think they're called, aren't they? And there's something there about life eventually coming to an end and becoming part of the earth, etc. And of course, for the 9 of Pentacles, which is the end of the numerical sequence of the Pentacles cards, because when you get to 10, you're really back to 1. You're going up to a different level, 1 plus 0. There's something there about fulfillment, about grounding, about earthing, about achievement, about having arrived at one's destination, arrived at one's home, having the fruits of one's labour around one, and being self-reliant like this little snail. And I like him because I call him Brian the Snail, like in the Magic Roundabout. Okay, and finally, the Queen of Pentacles. Again, we're with Pentacles, and the Queen is the penultimate Pentacle card before, of course, the Page. The Page of Pentacles I always think as being the representative of, if you like, us on Earth. So if you go through the tarot as a kind of a sequence of manifestation, starting with the Fool, the undefined, the unmanifest, and moving through the major arcana and then into all the suits. The Pentacles, and certainly in Kabbalistic thought, the Pentacles suit is the one that is closest to us because it's the Earth suit. And if you start at the Ace, which is the unmanifest or the potential of the Pentacles suit, and then down through the numbers, and then you get to the Courts, and the final card in that sequence is the Page of Pentacles. So that's like life on Earth, real life on Earth. It represents Malkuth on the Tree of Life, or is connected with that anyway. And I think, apart from the general earthy meaning of this card, it's interesting to me that a symbol that is very much about rebirth, regeneration, life, etc., the hare, is springing from, it looks to me as though springing from a position beside the Queen of Pentacles down to the next level, which would be the Page of Pentacles. So the idea of potential and life bursting forth, as represented by the tarot, is, I think, in this card. Now, some of those will have been very obvious to some of you. Some of you will be sitting there going, and that's fine. what I suggest you do is get your trusty magnifying glass or a pair of glasses or just a cup of tea and some time. Go through your tarot decks. Obviously the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is rich in symbolism, so is the Thoth deck, so are many tarot decks. And if you've got a deck that is a bit small, one of my favourite decks is the Spiral Tarot, which I think is absolutely beautiful, but the cards are heartbreakingly small, especially because the artwork is so intricate and complex. It's wonderful to take a magnifying glass to that deck and have a look at what's hidden. Now, finally, just before we finish, on the theme of looking more closely, one of the other tips I would add in is that if you are stuck in a tarot reading and you're struggling to understand what a card means, one of the temptations we can have quite often as tarot readers is to jump ahead to the next card. We just think, oh, I can't figure that out, I'll move to the next card. The other thing that can sometimes happen is when we do a spread, we have multiple cards and it can be a bit like not being able to see the forest for the trees because there's so much information there. So another tip to help you look more closely at your cards is when you do a spread, lay them out face down. And once you've got them all face down, turn the cards over individually. Now I know that some people prefer to be able to see the whole thing so they can get context, and that's fine, but it's an interesting exercise to challenge yourself to look at each card individually and interpret them initially in isolation, because after you've turned them all over you can then do a synthesis of everything you see there. But by turning them over individually and committing to going into the depth of that card, looking at what's in the foreground, looking at what's in the background, looking at the colours, looking at the way that the shapes interact, looking if there are people in the card, at the expressions on their faces, at their body language. You don't have to always be kind of trying to remember what's the tarot symbolism in this card, what is it I've been told by some of those tarot luminaries that I've read is important about this card. You can respond intuitively and aesthetically to the cards in front of you. You can look for yourself at what the colours say to you. Think also about what's your first impression. As that card flips over, what do you feel straight away? What is it that hits you in the gut straight away? That's not the gut, that's the chest. In the gut. What is it that hits you about what you see? And what does that tell you about what that card means for you in the current reading? So that, my friends, is today's tarot tip. And I will see you all again very, very soon. Take care.